Hey team, Ben Lawless here. Today I'd just like to talk to you about, I'm going to critique the curriculum and point out how it's not developmentally written. What I mean by that is that the achievement standards in the Victorian curriculum, but this is also true for the Australian curriculum and probably all curriculums in Australia, are not written according to developmental principles, which means that we can't really use it to infer progress between year levels because the achievement standards don't demonstrate any objective improvement in student performance from one to the other. What I'm saying should make more sense when I show you a few diagrams. So the first one we're going to look at here is the Australian curriculum. So here you'll see this is the Australian curriculum for history. This is all the way from grade 5 all the way up to year 10. So we're talking about 6 years of development. So we should be expecting to see 6 years of development in these achievement standards, but we don't. Firstly, you'll notice that they're in 2-year bands. So 5 and 6 only has one statement, 7 and 8 only has one statement, 9 and 10 only has one statement. I think the curriculum writers have done that so that for the content they have more flexibility about when they teach certain topics. Completely understandable. One of the side negative effects of that though is that there's less information about improvement in skills, and then there's entire skills with nothing at all. So this one here, for example, use historical terms and concepts. In the curriculum, there's zero development of that skill. In year 5, you're told to use historical terms and concepts, and in year 10, 6 years later, you are told to use historical terms and concepts. There's nothing about, explaining terms and concepts, analyzing terms and concepts. You could very easily come up with more sophisticated criteria there, but they have none. In fact, a really obvious one would be to separate out terms and concepts, right? Using terms is a lot easier than using historical concepts, but we see none of that in there. Even more bizarrely, we've got this one here, identify and locate a range of relevant sources. That's great, that's what you do in year 5 and 6. When you get up to high school though, you do the exact same thing, identify and locate relevant sources using ICT and other methods. Now, call me crazy, but how else do you identify and locate relevant sources if you're not using ICT or other methods? So, not a lot of development going on in here at all. I'm going to show you now the Victorian achievement standards for history from years 7 to 10, and you'll see in a bit more detailed analysis exactly the same issue and the implications of that. So here are the achievement standards for years 7, 8, 9, and 10. And again, you will note that there's only one achievement standard for both years 7 and 8. So even without anything else, the idea that that government schools in Victoria have to report using so-called progression points, which is where students are halfway between, year 6 and year 7, or between year 7 and year 8. Well, the fact is there's only a statement for the end of level 8. There's no statement for level 7, so how you go from level 7 to level 8 is built into the structure of the curriculum. There's no information about that at all, which is weird. One thing to note here is that, these are massively wordy achievement standards. The writers of the curriculum, there's one short paragraph and one medium length paragraph, but if you actually take all of these long sentences and separate them out into the skills that they describe, you'll find that there's a lot. So I've taken those achievement standards and separated them out into different skills and sub-skills. So the total number, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. So across years 7 to 10, there's 20 separate sub-skills that students are expected to be taught and learn and, I guess, be assessed on from years 7 to 8. 20, right? That's a lot. Now, this is going from left to right, so the idea is you'll notice that when there are two statements in the same sub-skill, I've separated them by sophistication, so identify is easier than explaining. So that's why I've got identify here and explain there. But I'm just separating them out based on the year 7 and 8, and then the year 9s and 10s will come later. So I prefer to go from down to up. So in this next slide, it's the exact same information, but it's just transposed. So there we go. Now, what I'm going to show you on the slide after this is I've mapped those criteria to Bloom's taxonomy. Now, I'm not saying that Bloom's taxonomy is the be-all and end-all, and that higher up in Bloom's necessarily means higher difficulty. It's a pretty loose cognitive framework, but you can map these statements to it just to get a general gist about whether or not there's some obvious progression from easier to harder, or from more and more sophisticated performance in a skill. So when I map this to Bloom's, if the curriculum is developmental, you should expect to see, even with the mapping, red, because that's 7 and 8, and then blue on top of it, right? That's what this should look like. So I'll show you this next slide and you'll see that unfortunately that is not the case. So a couple of things to tell you about here. Firstly, you'll see there's a new color in there. Why is there a new color? Purple means the exact same statement as in the year 7, 8 and 9, 10 achievement standards. Red obviously is year 7, 8, blue is year 9, 10. So just looking at that, you'll notice that it doesn't go from red to blue in most cases. It does a few, but let's just go along each one and have a look. So here, this one's not too bad. You've got the lowest is in both year 7, 8 and 9, 10, and then there's an explain one here, but the year 9, 10s are expected to evaluate. So that's kind of okay. There is red going underneath the blue, which means it's getting progressively more difficult. But why there's no explain in the year 10 when there was in year 7, 8, I don't know. It's a bit weird. Next one, but like, you know, that's a little bit developmental. So I'm going to put I'll give it a little orange circle if I think it's a little bit developmental, just so we can see which ones aren't too bad. There we go. Yep, that one's kind of okay. Let's have a look at the next one. So we've got a blue, which is 9, 10, and then above it we've got purple, which is both 7, 8 and 9, 10, right? So there's a 7, 8 criteria analyzing, which is more difficult than explaining, which is in 9, 10. So that's definitely not developmental. Here, for establishing historical significance, there's two different evaluate ones, but what they ask you to evaluate slightly different. Evaluate individuals and groups versus evaluating evidence. In terms of difficulty, they're pretty much exactly the same, I would say, and yet they're both, you know, that's a 7, 8, but that's a 9, 10, yet they're the same difficulty, so that shouldn't be right. Historical perspectives, you've got a few different things here, but they're equal difficulty when really the reds should be below the blues, which they're not. For this one here, analysing developments, there's nothing about that at all in year 7 and 8, but there is 9, 10. Here we've got one that is developmental, the red one by itself is fine. That I guess is as well. Here again we've got a weird one because that's the purple's in 7, 8 and in 9, 10. So it's the same statements repeated in all of them, and then he's got a little bit more difficult one there. Here that's in both. Here, identify origin of sources is in 9, 10, and yet in 7, 8 they've got an explaining one, which is arguably a lot harder than identifying. So who knows? There's another little bit here which is probably developmental, which is these three here. Get my drawing happening. They there, yeah, see there's red, 7, 8 below the blue, 9, 10, and that's what you'd expect to see. That's what you should see if the curriculum is developmental. Here though, look at this, we've got a red and then a blue, everything looking hunky-dory, and then up here we've got evaluate, which is very high level, and that's expected, that's at the achievement standard for 7, 8 and 9, 10. doesn't make sense. That next one has a red below a blue, so yeah, we could say that's developmental. That there looks all right. Here, the next one here, you'll see that's purple and that's purple, so the exact same statements for the whole of 4 years. So how, the idea that it's getting more complex from 7 to 10 is not included in there. Here, these ones are at the same difficulty and these ones are at the same difficulty. So this is all over the place, yeah. Heaps of it has stuff at the 7 and 10. The 7 and 8 is exactly the same as in the 9, 10, which shouldn't be right. So like there, for example, this stuff's all exactly the same. That's exactly the same. All this stuff's exactly the same. So like the achievement standards for those ones are exactly the same for years 7, 8 and 9, 10. So how you're supposed to demonstrate progress from one to the other is unclear. And then you've got what's probably the biggest problem of all is this stuff where you've got a blue above a red. So like this one here, there's a blue, but then there's a purple above it, which means that's red and blue, right? So the curriculum writers are expecting year 7s to analyze, even though they're only expecting year 10s to explain. Weird. Here again, you've got that purple one is in both, and yet there's only a high one for year 10s. And again, this one here is another one that really stands out. Year 7s are expected to evaluate exactly the same as the year 10s are expected to evaluate. So to cut a very long story short, the curriculum is not developmental because we don't see the achievement standards asking students to move up Bloom's taxonomy. Yeah, really, if it was developmental, you should see a pattern of red criteria and then blue criteria above them, which you do see a little bit, but not enough. So what are the implications for us as developmental educators? Basically, you can't use the criteria in the achievement standards to create a developmental progression because they're not leveled developmentally. So we can teach the skills that the curriculum writers have asked us to teach, but in terms of trying to come up with a progress measure, we can't use the curriculum to do that because the curriculum does not demonstrate progression, which is why we learn to write developmental rubrics ourselves and then we fill in those criteria. Thanks very much.